For this week's Good Gig episode, I interviewed Dr. Cory Padilla, a product manager for the California-based company CantataBio, a biotech firm specializing in genomic tool development for diverse applications, from cancer research to agribusiness. Cory received a Ph.D. in biological sciences from the Georgia Institute of Technology in 2017, working at the interface of microbiology, genomics, and oceanography. In earning his doctorate, he learned that academia wasn't the right path for him, and that industry was a more attractive option. He spoke to me about that decision, the benefit of the PhD training, the process of entering industry from academics, and the stresses and benefits of his job. We recorded this episode in March 2025.
Yeah.
So I think the question of what you're going to do after graduate school is something that you get asked almost on day one in a PhD program, or maybe even before that. But do you recall when you first started thinking about that question?
Yeah, I think it started in undergrad, actually. I was very fortunate to work in John Zayer's lab as an undergrad,
At UC Santa Cruz, right?
at UC Santa Cruz, yeah, as a banana slug. And that lab was really interesting because we had kind of like this rotating group of undergrads that would kind of circulate through every quarter or every semester, and maybe two or three of us really hung on for more than a quarter. And then after we sort of, defined our role within that lab and became a consistent face within that lab, we were starting to get trained really deeply in molecular biology. And during that process, I got to talk to grad students, postdocs, career researchers that maybe weren't eyeing PI roles, but didn't really want to leave academia because they enjoyed their postdoc so much that if they could find a role for research, that would be great for them. So I knew that at some level, after maybe about the first year, that I was going to go into grad school. And then after grad school, or during grad school and even before, I kind of had the ivory towers in sight. I felt like with my training at Woods Hole, at University of Hawaii, and at Santa Cruz, I was kind of being set up for this great career in academia. And it wasn't really until the third year in grad school that I realized that
At
maybe
Georgia Tech.
at Georgia Tech, yeah. And maybe that the PI position might not be for me. It came really off the heels of the last graduate student fellowship submission and rejection. I was feeling really frustrated because I could understand as an entry level grad student and I had one paper in review at that time from some of the work that I had done at Santa Cruz as an undergrad, and even like as a middle of the stack author. But it was unproven. My GPA wasn't the greatest, but I know my work ethic and my training and the experience I had in the labs that I worked in where it was good enough to kind of set me up on a path to be successful as a grad student and to publish papers. And so I understand the first year that not going very well, getting reviews back. And then the second time through, I was like, well, okay, I now have a paper or two published. I have grad student curriculum under my belt, which I was getting great grades in, right? I was checking the boxes, and the response came back like, oh, this is your application was okay, but your undergraduate grades still don't really say that you're going to set yourself up for success in grad school. And then at the third time around, where I was clearly being successful, I have more than one paper out as either a primary author or a secondary author. Getting a response back like, yeah, we still think you're going to be very successful. We don't think you're the right sort of phenotype to make it past grad school. So that was really disheartening. And then also being out at sea with you and other PIs and realizing how much time you all spent writing grants, and how much emphasis is put on that, just kind of really being like, I'm not the greatest writer. I'm a great storyteller. I can talk my way in through situations, but writing my way through to get money is not really a path that I thought I would be really successful with, and it felt like it would be setting myself for a lot of frustration. Peer review in itself is frustrating, but it's manageable because there's a decent amount of logic applied to it, and to some extent, it's true in grant writing. But it feels like the grant sort of mentality of being a PI was just not something that I was really excited about. And then you start looking at other roles within academia, like could I be a career researcher in a lab? I was like, that sounds like a lot of fun. I think I would have had a blast had I gone a postdoc route, right? There was a ton of momentum built up from the research that I'd done in your lab. I had a ton of connections that I built through the other universities that I had worked for, and I had both friends, colleagues, and mentors kind of around me that I don't know, I would have had so much fun as a postdoc, and I think that would have probably lended itself into a really nice researcher career. But there's a couple things at play in terms of, you know, would the compensation match the work?
Mm,
And while I think science is super fun, I think the act of having an idea and trying to find it wrong, like how often and how many creative ways can you try to prove your idea wrong, to rule out, right, that this hypothesis is null, right? I think that endeavor is a lot of fun. But it's also just a ton of work. You're kind of thinking all the time. Even when you're not working on it, you're probably actively thinking about it in some way, shape, or form. And I thought that if I wasn't going to make a PI type role, that the payout for the time might be better in industry.
mm.
And then I was sort of left with this thought of like, oh man, my past maybe 10 years or so has really led me down path A. And now I'm realizing with maybe a year and a half left in grad school
Mhm.
that I need to start thinking about path B and what that might look like and what skill sets do I have to get my foot in the door because I had zero connections at that time. But yeah, but to be honest, I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. I had a clear goal in mind when I entered grad school, and then that goal very quickly pivoted with not a whole lot of time to, I think, make that adjustment.
No, that's an interesting story, and it's certainly one I've heard many times before in slightly different different iterations. And I'm kind of struck by how commonly I hear it, because I can kind of see two different forces driving you to make the decision to go into industry. The first is that you start off kind of on this academic path, and maybe it's not fully solidified in your head, but you're kind of working towards that. And then the negatives of the academic track push you off of it and push you into industry. The alternative is that you're pulled by the desire to get a training that will make you competitive for industry. So in other words, there's the positives of the industry that are pulling you forward. And these are not two mutually exclusive things, but to be honest, I hear more stories of the former path, like people entering graduate school with this idea of the life of a professor and the many positives that are associated with that, and then getting slowly, but sometimes very quickly, aware of all of the challenges associated with it as well, and then finding something else to do. But I'm probably just not seeing those people that say, okay, I know I want to work for Monsanto, or I know I want to work for Merck or something like that. And I recognize the PhD as my route to that. I think there's a sizable proportion of PhD students that would fall into that category as well.
The point that you just bring up about not necessarily interacting with the people who have industry in mind, I actually think that's a pretty big function of the environmental
Mm,
sciences. Having worked in industry now for a bit, and particularly jumping fully off track of the environmental into like human health and human gene regulation and even epigenetics to a large extent, a lot of the PhDs that we hire, their labs themselves are quite industrious. They
mm,
are They are in the business of making new molecular methods, and they always have an eye on a patent, right?
Hmm.
Oftentimes they'll file a patent before they publish the paper. It's funny, our current VP of R&D, Lisa Munding, she's wicked smart. But even in her lab, they said they kind of had this product idea wall where you would just take the fun term of the day and throw seek behind it and think about what would be, the molecular process by which you would make that particular readout on a sequencer, and then what would you use it for, right? And so it was sort of this like word puzzle that once a week you would just kind of scramble things up. And it's like, is that a viable technology to use? And what would you use it for? And even at UC Santa Cruz, where my company got spun out of, there's now like this whole biotech startup facility slightly off campus where professors can take their grad students or postdocs that have developed a new technology and give it time and space to breathe and see, is this a viable product to fit a market and to generate a business around. Now, when I was going to Santa Cruz, that wasn't a thing at all, right? That area was all like a marine biology sanctuary type thing.
Yeah.
But I do see that you get more TIs that are producing grad students with the idea of right out of grad school, you could be a chief technology officer.
Well, that's a really valuable point, and I'm glad you kind of corrected me on it because I think I'm completely biased by that exact factor. We came through an arena of science where the options are, I think, fewer
Hmm.
once you get your PhD. At least that's the perception, maybe to start with. Whereas fields of health sciences, fields of engineering are very different in that respect. I think you have a much clearer sense of what your potential path could look like post PhD, and you see that there are many, many other options than just academic. I guess I felt that way in graduate school. Now, retrospectively thinking about it, I was surrounded by people that only really talked about going into academics and becoming a professor. And that was probably institution specific, but it was also because I was in an evolutionary biology program. So at kind of what point in this process did you start exploring the options, and what did that look like for you? If you knew, 3 years into it that academics is not going to be what you want to end up in, how did you start exploring the other options? What was the path forward for you at that point? Because you
Yeah,
were quite successful. You graduated in a typical time for completing a dissertation, and you had a job lined up after you graduated, if I remember correctly. So talk a little bit about how you explored those options and what kind of type of factors were you thinking about? I know one of them. I know geography was one of them. There were
geography
other.
was a very big one, right? In academia, you don't always get to pick where you live, you go where the job is. But in biotech, there are clear hubs of places where jobs are concentrating. So, obviously geography was one, but the other thing was, coming from that environmental space that we just talked about, I had no idea. I had no idea what jobs were available to a PhD trained molecular biologist who focused on marine microbial ecology, right? It was a, I thought it was very niche. But then what you start doing is start mapping out your skill sets. Okay, yes, I know microbiology, I know oceanography, but I also know how to run a sequencer now. I know how to compute sequence data. At the time, I was a little bit more black boxed, right? I was using like very openly sourced tools that people had developed. I didn't spend any time developing, but I knew my way enough around a command line that I could hit my head against a keyboard and make something work. And I knew how to interpret those results and make sure that they aligned with my understanding of what the expectation of the data going in versus the data coming out or the results coming out were to be. I knew qPCR like the back of my hand. I knew that I knew how to run a lab in one way, shape, or form. Even as an undergrad, right? Checking freezers, checking, just like general lab maintenance, making sure you had stocks of what you need to run your experiments. planning out your experimental budget for a month, how to do field work, how to collect, just sort of mapping out all of those skills. And you sort of go, okay, well, my expertise is really in how to use these tools within microbiology, right? And so you start looking at places that do microbiology. I think Second Genome was a big company at the time that I was potentially looking at. There were a few other, like the big companies like Thermo, New England Biosciences, right? They do stuff in molecular biology. Those are bigger companies. And then you just, I don't know, you start searching for microbiology jobs, and you start looking through the different options that are available. Like there were terms that I had never really come across before, like field application scientist, right? And what's the difference between an application scientist and an R&D scientist? What's right, an associate researcher versus an associate scientist, right? There's a lot of different sort of monikers that industry is sort of solidified around that maybe don't make sense if you haven't looked at it going in. And then you start sort of filtering jobs based on whether they have a PhD requirement or not. And what I have found is that in general, some of these smaller startup companies, when they put out a job search, it's really this big wish list of like the absolute perfect person for that role. And what you have to do is look at those things and be like, do I fit 80% of that role? Do I fit 50% of that role? Do I fit 25% of that role? And you sort of start whittling down, places that you might want to look. The other place that is actually really useful in getting your foot in the door are recruiters. So as
Mm.
jobs open up, these companies will go out and pay recruiting firms to go in and kind of do the dirty work, right? Sift through resumes, identify people that may or may not be interested. So reaching out to recruiters is a really good way to understand where your resume and your skill set might fit within the current job openings that exist. The other thing that I knew going in is that I didn't really want to stay at the bench. Whilst I was good at pipetting, I knew that's really not where my passion for the sciences was. I like storytelling. I will tell a story about data all day long. You can put me in front of a big crowd of people. I don't care. I will talk about whatever scientific story that's exciting. It's a fun part of academia for me that I've always enjoyed. But I also knew that my skill set was very much rooted in the hard skills, right? The physical pipetting, the physical running of a sequencer, the doing the data analysis stuff, right? And so I thought maybe the best route, well, once you just got to get your foot in the door somehow. And then
Right.
there's a tremendous amount of space to move laterally to find a good home for your skill set and what you're good at. But I just, needed a foot in the door, and I will say recruiters are a very good place to get you started. They'll show you jobs that you might not have known that you should look for. Like field application scientist or scientific affairs is another one. They're very nebulous terms, and they you don't really know exactly what they mean, and they often mean different things to different companies.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's a few things of what you said that I want to touch upon really quick before I flit out of my head. But
yeah.
the first is this kind of discrepancy potentially between a job description as written by a company to find somebody and what might be actually suitable or sufficiently above the bar for somebody that they're looking for. And I think about this a lot because I talk to people that are currently in the process of looking for jobs, and they'll see a job description and it's got, 20 different bullets of things that they're looking for, or expertise that they're looking for, or very specific things that they expect a potential applicant to maybe have done or certainly to be capable of doing. And I think most job applications or most job ads just scare people because of that. There's so much that is potentially stuff that they have not quite done yet. And so they fixate on that and they say, oh, I haven't done that, or I can't do that, or that's what this job is really about, and therefore I'm not appropriate for it. When in actuality, I think what you described is a lot more encouraging and probably much closer to the truth, right? I think, that's an ideal, that's a description of an ideal but there's many people that would, in reality, be quite appropriate for the job. And they don't necessarily have to have met all 20 of those bullets.
No, it's a wish
That's
list.
that's so great to hear.
Yeah, it shouldn't discourage people from applying. I do think there is a little bit of self-evaluation, and I
Mm,
self-evaluation is hard. You tend to overinflate the things that you like, and you tend to also overinflate the things that you might not be good at. And so if there's a bullet there that is something that you might not be great at, it's like, oh, well, that's the thing that they're really looking for. No, it's not. They're
mm,
looking for somebody who can do 80% of the things that are on there with some level of competency, and there's always on the job training.
yeah.
So, it's daunting, but it shouldn't be discouraging. Yeah.
And there's no harm to applying, right? Like the worst case is that you don't get the job.
Yeah, well, the just before we move on from that, the first job that I applied for within the current company that I'm at, Dovetail Genomics, was a PhD level assay developer. And I didn't know this because they hadn't advertised it at the time, but they had just gotten a NIH small business grant to develop out their technology for metagenomics. And they saw my application and said, "We don't like you for the job you applied for, but we like you for this job."
Yeah.
And the job title was a PI position to run that grant. And they said, "You're a bit too junior to run that grant, but your skill set and your publication rate tells us you'd likely be pretty okay at this." And they also kind of maybe saw it as a way to maybe not pay that PI salary to bring someone in who wouldn't be looking for a PI role in academia, for example, right?
Mhm.
And quickly jumped in and started working at a PI capacity on this grant, even though I applied for a totally different role. So you also have no idea what these companies are doing in the background. That's very intentional. They care very much about their intellectual property and they don't want things going out into the wild until they're ready for it. So if
Mhm.
you submit your application, they bank a lot of applications. And when a role comes up that you fit the bill for, they will reach out.
No, that's absolutely invaluable advice. Just because you're not appropriate for the position that you're applying for doesn't mean that there isn't something else at the organization that would fit you very well. Another thing that you mentioned is kind of your self-awareness that you didn't really want to keep down the bench scientist path. And I think that aligns very closely to what probably kept me out of considering industry as well. I certainly appreciated bench science work and I was good at it. I was very detail oriented, but I got bored with it pretty quickly, or some aspects of it. And I recognized that probably like you, I appreciated more of the storytelling aspect of the management of science more than the bench science itself. I'd like to advise on appropriate bench science and experimental design, but I don't necessarily want to be the person holding the pipette all the time. And I think that kept me out of applying or even thinking about industry because maybe I foolishly assumed that every step into an industry position was kind of a step into a bench scientist role. And what you're saying is there's many, many other roles that somebody with a PhD could take up in industry.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I didn't appreciate when I jumped in was on the commercial side of organizations, how many PhDs sit in biotech
Mhm.
on the commercial side. So I was actually thinking about this the other day where our company's maybe about 30 people. We have 12 or 13 PhDs, and that's almost evenly split between R&D and commercial.
Interesting.
So our director of marketing, my direct boss, he's a PhD and a postdoc trained scientist. Our CEO is a PhD. Also, he passed the bar, so he's a JD as well.
Hmm.
Um, our lead of technical support is a PhD. We have one PhD who's on our sales team. And then we have myself, who's a product manager who still can sometimes molecular biology in a pinch. I also developed a lot of our computational workflows. So when there's technical stuff, I get called in for that. And then we have, PhDs that are director levels of bioinformatics. Our VP of R&D is a PhD. So there's a lot. Oh, we also, sorry, on the commercial side, we have a role called a scientific liaison. who, as these new technologies that may be a little esoteric come online, go out to the people that might be interested and see, what sort of collaboration could we generate with these very important opinion leaders on technology and or in a particular application space, and their whole job is to get them on board with the technology and get them to try it, get them to use it. So, and even my role before product management was this role called scientific affairs. It was a very similar style role, but I was more of somebody who managed our outward vision of our science and what we were doing. I was a PhD for the commercial team, so I'd go out and I'd speak. I'd be a speaker at conferences. I wouldn't necessarily be working at the booth, right, in the industry part of it, but I would actually be a speaker, or presenting posters or presenting some of the latest stuff that was coming out of the R&D lab. So there's, the soft skills of the PhD, right? The teaching, the learning, the communication around science, the storytelling is is wildly valuable to the commercial organization because you have to remember that in most cases you are selling to other scientists, right?
Mhm.
You're empowering their work, and you at some level there is this trust that if you're talking to somebody else with a PhD, that they're going to give you the sound advice of, hey, maybe this technology isn't for you for this experiment. If you had experiment X, Y, and Z, then this is where you'd pick that up, right?
Mhm.
So as customers are talking to a sales rep, they kind of go, yeah, you're a sales rep, right? You have that title. Your job is to sell me stuff. No matter how much technical stuff you can put around it, that's still their job at the end of the day. But if
Sure.
you bring somebody in who's not necessarily linked to a commission, but understands the technology, can understand the science that's being done, and just say, yeah, that makes sense. Or if it was me, I wouldn't do it that way. Right. And there's a level of respect in the community once you have that PhD attached to your name. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've gone into a meeting and been like, ooh, that's a really cool experiment, but you wouldn't use us for that. You
Mhm.
you might try X, Y, and Z because that would get to your answer far more effectively than what we provide.
Do you feel that most of the PhD holding individuals at your firm that are more on the commercial side first entered as bench scientists, or did they have a PhD and recognize that they could apply for other roles from the start? Or do they really need to enter as bench scientists and then move laterally?
That's a good question. I think we all at some level started as bench scientists. The roles, a lot of the roles that we see entry level for PhD, if you're coming into a commercials, um, are usually FAS or customer support or technical support. And even at that, even though they're commercial roles, they are very technical people who will sometimes do on the job training with customers and go in and have a kit shipped to the customer. They meet them there. They show them how to pipette the thing, right?
Mm.
Or if for computation stuff, pull up the command line and walk them through stuff. Those are the ones where you kind of start in the commercial. And typically we see folks that apply for those roles that come from what I like to think of as more application
Mhm.
science arenas rather than engineering science arenas.
Right.
So like I look at what my PhD was like. I was not developing new tools. My PhD was taking the knowledge base that I had of the system and applying these pre-vetted tools, and I was applying those to learn something new about a system that exists, right? We weren't patenting new methods. But then there are cellular and molecular biology groups that are just, like I said earlier, truly in that business of making new tools. And what we do find is that the transition from a really good R&D idea to people purchasing it is the application. And while R&D does often keep the application in mind, it's really the application space that ends up selling the product. And you have to have a PhD there. It doesn't have to be like a master's student can sometimes fill in these roles. But if you really want to move up into those positions, being truly able to understand like what the customer is really trying to do with the data that's being generated is you almost have to have a PhD to really get it.
So I know you don't work for the HR component of your company, but you probably have some sense of what the company is looking for when they hire PhDs.
Yeah, like you said, probably not as in depth, but I have over the years done I don't even know how many rounds of interviews for different
Mhm.
positions. And the things that we really look for are, do we feel like the person could do the job, right? Based on their experience. We really need somebody, for example, who does ChipSeek and knows ChipSeek backwards, forwards, inside out, up and down, can do it in space, doesn't matter. That's their jam, right? So we look at these jobs and be like, okay, do they do we think based on their experience that they fit that mold, like that they're that person? We try not to be too exclusionary in that step because there's another really big component, which is, are you somebody that I think we could work with, right? And that often falls out during the face-to-face or nowadays Zoom to Zoom interview, which I got to be honest, I feel for people now that especially during COVID that really had to apply and do the whole job interview solely over Zoom because it's little bit harder to get a read of maybe somebody's inquisitiveness around the company just in words alone, right? Sometimes a tour of the facility where you can just see people like gravitate towards certain things and that's a part of it, but just in the conversation. Are you asking questions that make sense, right? Did you do your homework, right? That's another one that I think is something that really comes to light during the in-person or over Zoom interview. There are some like weird things when you can tell people haven't done their homework, right? When you're talking to them and then all of a sudden you see the light switch on their camera, just like I did there, where they're switching tabs and they just pulled up your website and they're trying to find
Yeah,
the
sorry.
answer that right? So there are little like, things that happen where you go, oh, okay, like, you were just maybe interested in this job for the sake of the job, not so much that you were interested in the direction of the company and felt like you could make a difference within the company, right? And so that is one thing that you look for is not just a good mind and a good set of hands. You are looking for a coworker, someone who will get down in the trenches when things get hard and do the job, right? And people that care enough to get down in the trenches with you, right? Those are things that are hard to convey. But usually your sense of, engagement in the process will go a really long way.
The idea of hiring a person is universal. Like you and we think about the same things when bringing graduate students into our labs or into our department. We want not only an individual who is smart and capable, but we want somebody who can be part of the family. So one thing that I always encourage students or others who are thinking about any career really is to make sure that you spend some time thinking about job security, like the security of a position, and also spend some time thinking about the potential for either lateral or vertical movement once you get into that position. And the latter is something I really didn't think about when I first started out in academics. It never really like solidified in my head that if you start in the path of becoming a professor, you've basically got two or three steps ahead of you before you're done moving forward. Like you enter, you work towards getting tenure as an assistant professor. You get tenure, hopefully. Then you become an associate professor, which is the next step up, which really doesn't get you too much more, except maybe a slight pay increase. And then you spend another few years working towards the goal of becoming a full professor. And then once you get that, you're kind of there. You know? Yeah, like that's the plateau of the vertical
Yeah,
hierarchy. It's not and so but that's fine. That's just the way academics work. And so
yeah,
the benchmarks for moving forward are not necessarily career rank. They are advancement of knowledge through the field, discoveries, et cetera, right? So you just have different deliverables and benchmarks that you're working towards. But I do think it's appropriate for people to think about that.
Yeah, so I think the first one, security, is an interesting idea. I don't really know the best way to answer that. The what I have found is that in general, if you do the hard work and you engage with, like, you're not a passenger on the ship. If you're willing to pick up an oar and start rowing, you will have job security. I have
Mhm.
seen a number within my company and also external in other companies where there have been rounds of layoffs, where there have been company reorganizations. And I think the people who are picking up the oars and rowing that are not being passive about the job or just treating it like a 9 to 5 tend to have really good job security. Because even if there is a shakeup, and you prove that you are somebody who is capable and who has time and time again moved the company in a correct direction, right? Even in times of shakeup, they'll go, we'll find a spot for you. It might not be what you thought it was going to be, but we'll still bring you along for the ride because we know that you're a valuable person. That being said, there are times in which company direction just dramatically changes. And even if you are somebody who was really actively participating, it's a business at the end of the day, and if the numbers don't line up, the numbers don't line up, and things need to change. There are roles that are more and less secure within biotech. In general, if you are at the bench or in the command line and you are generating IPable ideas, you're pretty secure. IP is a really weird thing where it might make you money right now, but it also might make you money in 20 years. You don't
Mhm.
really know when whatever discovery or thing that you've invented will become useful, right? So if you're somebody who is building the IP profile for a company, they're going to keep you around and they're going to keep you happy because you are basically increasing the net worth of the company, right? It's like buying more and more and more houses, right?
Mhm.
The more property that you own, the ability for you to cash flow against that property becomes really high. So if you're really good at that, they're, you're going to be around for a long time. I mean, you don't even have to be really good at it, but if you're consistently participating in projects that are getting to that point, you're a super valuable member of the company, and that's a really
Mhm.
secure role. And even if there is a massive change in direction and you get let go, you can point to your resume and be like, I was a part of this many IP adventures, right? And
Yeah.
people look at that almost as with way more weight than publication rate, right? Once you've got into industry, it's like, okay, it's cool that you publish, but did you IP anything? If you're at the bench, right? And so that becomes a little bit of the measurement, right? And so if you're in that type of role, you're going to feel pretty secure. And even if the job goes away, you won't have such a hard time finding another job. On the more commercial side of things, customer facing roles are incredibly valuable because you are directly tied to revenue. And whether or not you like it, and this is something I've had to come to terms with multiple times, is once you leave academia, you are at some level responsible for revenue of a company. I like to help people do cool stuff. I really do. That's where I get a lot of my job satisfaction. It just so happens that now when I help people do cool stuff, the company gets money from it, right? Like I have to work my brain around that a little bit. But even at some level R&D, if you're building things that aren't bringing in money, well, okay, that'll set the IP profile, but it doesn't help us today right now. So at some level, everybody within the company is tied to generating revenue, but more so on the commercial side. And the people who stay in the back and don't necessarily foster relationships with your customer base, those are people that are as easy as it can be to let someone go. And having seen bits this in different arenas, it's never easy. Nobody ever likes it. Nobody ever wants to do it.
Mm.
But if it comes to that point in time, if you're not customer facing and you're more of a cog in the wheel in the back, it's a lot easier to make a case to not have that overhead in your budget. And if you are successful, again, in that sort of customer facing, consistently doing things that you can link to revenue, even if you are a part of a layoff, you won't have as hard of a time finding a job because your resume and the people that you work for will back up what you did and say, it wasn't this person's fault that we weren't hitting revenue. A, it was a company shift that, and now this is a very talented person who's in the market, right? So those roles have incredible high job security. The ones that are a little bit more in the back, those are ones that are like, well, it'd be nice if we had a dedicated person to do that job, but we could also divvy that up across three other people and the job would still get done. But I do find PhDs in general to have really solid job security within biotech.
So what about that second question of
Growth.
vertical mobility? Is that something you think about on a regular basis?
Yes and no. I think if you think about it all the time, it's really easy to become disillusioned with the job that you're doing.
That's right. That's right.
It's something that, you maybe want to think about once a quarter, twice a year, and to have frank and honest conversations with your supervisors about. I will say for a industry, or sorry, for an R&D style role within industry, I would say it's somewhat similar to the academic route. There is a plateau of which you reach, which is like a VP of R&D or
Mhm.
a chief technology officer. But those you have to be at the company for a really, really long time to get, or your pedigree has to be super high to get into one of those type roles. A lot of times you see people tap out, probably not the right word, but like plateau at the staff scientist level, where they've been around enough, they know the technology, they might have a few RAs associated with them, but they'll also go to the bench and pick up a scientist. They're driving experimental design. They're approving that experimental design through the VP of R&D or chief technology officer. Um, but that's where I see most PhDs kind of end up at, is that staff scientist role. In the commercial setting, I have yet to find like a true limit as to what your job opportunity growth could be.
Interesting.
The variability and diversity of roles that exist in the commercial setting are wild. Um, and the growth is can literally be anything you want it to be, because if you're again associated with bringing in revenue or some shape, like they let their dogs eat, right? Like they want their people who are bringing in money to have really good job satisfaction. And so it does take a lot of work, and it's a lot of, like for example, after this at 8 p.m. tonight, I have a call with Asia, with a customer in Asia. Do I want to take a call at 8? No, but I know that if I take that call and they get revenue out of that, everyone's going to be happy. I'm going to be happy because everyone else is happy, right? But the flexibility is really, really high. A lot of people like will come in and start as an FAS, or as an application scientist, and then maybe move into oversee customer support. Or you can go to product management and become like chief product officer. I know a lot of CEOs have a foot in product management in one way, shape, or form, because you basically run a mini business within your business. Director of marketing, VP of marketing are really good roles that that people move into. And then once you're there, you're kind of eyeing the C-suite, or that's where you're kind of going to end up uh, living. And then the other thing too that isn't so apparent if you're on the outside looking in R&D, you might get a yearly bonus, a flat bonus, or something like that. If you're in the commercial side of the industry, your ability to get income is not capped. It's truly not capped. Yes, you have your sales reps that make commission, but a lot of commercial based roles have what you call is like a variable salary. So you get a fixed salary, which is pretty solid if you're a PhD. And then if the company hits all their revenue goals, you start earning incremental percentages on that.
Mm,
So I know some people that make CEO level money on the ability to generate revenue, their hit revenue goals, even though
interesting.
they're not in a CEO position. Your salary might not be as consistent, but the roof of that salary is not really capped. Where in R&D, that salary is very consistent, but your growth is pretty capped.
That's really interesting. That people will want to hear that. I mean, people make career decisions on a lot of different factors, but obviously financial security is one of them. So I think I'm really appreciative of you speaking towards that. So I know we're getting a little long on time, Corey. I just want to ask you maybe one more question. So I'll just end with kind of a general question, like, what is the thing that or things that stress you out the most about your job without, you don't need to get too specific.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess what is the thing or things that make you happiest that you chose this path?
Yeah, so I think the things that are stressful, there's two big ones. The first one is general decision making at a company level.
Mm,
That is super challenging. There's a lot of opinions in the room. There are a lot of personality types in the room. You all have to find a way to row in the same direction with the same amount of energy and be on the same page of why a decision was made and be at peace and be able to articulate downward through the company why a decision was made. The longer I've been at the company, the more and more and more I get involved with decision making at the organization level rather than just at an individual project level. And oh boy, is that hurting cats? Is that knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know are really important. And knowing if you can actually get to the spot that you know that you've made a right decision, it's really challenging. There's a lot of really good tools out there like Scrum meetings and force ranking activities where you're able to collect everybody's opinions and identify gaps and go get the information that fills the gaps. But the error bars on business decisions are huge, right? It is so hard to size a market accurately and make a decision on that. You can collect all the evidence that you can, but you're talking like millions of dollars worth of error bars. And the bigger the market, the bigger the error bars, right? So that in itself is challenging when you have that many personalities, inputs, outputs into how a decision is being made. And it is also like people's livelihoods are if we go this route, will we be able to keep the whole team? If we don't, do we not? Right? And
mhm.
so things like that are pretty stressful. The other thing within my particular role as a product manager that is pretty stressful are the ebbs and flows of product launch cycles and how that usually ties to field activities like going out to conferences and things like that. So about once or twice a year, my job gets stupid crazy, just absolutely crazy. The amount of hours it takes to put in to get the thing over the finish line and out into the world. It is R&D always has great ideas. You want to incorporate as many of those as you can. And at some point you have to draw a line and like, no, no, this has got to wait for version 2. Otherwise we're not launching, this thing that we all invested time, energy, and effort and money into, right? But those times can get really compressed. And it as much as you can try to plan and build and prepare, it just always gets compressed. Right. It's reminds me a little bit of field work where you have a distinct amount of time to cram in as much work as you possibly can, given the resources that you have. But on the back end of that, there's a tremendous amount of job flexibility where once you're in sustained phase, I'm not saying you kick up your feet, but maybe your work week is 30 hours, and you can take a little bit of a vacation and work, like take a few phone calls, answer a few emails, and no one's gonna bat an eye at it because you did the job and you got it done, and everybody knows that you were putting in like 100-hour work weeks, right? It's right. There's ebbs and flows. Um, it's one of the reasons, one of the things that I do like about my current job is interacting with people. I give a lot of webinars. If you actually go to our website, you could see me in this office or another iteration of this office talking through almost all of our products, talking through computational stuff, talking through very technical stuff, very high level stuff, talking about cancer research, which is not something I ever thought I'd be doing as a grad student in marine microbiology and oceanography. But so like the interaction and the ability to storytell on the commercial side is something that to this day I just have a blast with. It's super fun. The other things that I really enjoy about my current role are I always get to learn something new almost every day because I'm interacting with customers in fields that I don't know anything about. So that customer interaction is really satisfying because I get to like be a scientist again and learn about cool things that I don't know about, right? And then there's things about like market sizing research where I can apply my very analytical brain to very intricate problems that don't necessarily have the best data associated with them. Um, I still at some level compute. Never thought I'd be that great at negative binomial distributions and stuff like that, but figured that out. And then, like I said earlier, still get to go to conferences. I still get to speak at conferences, so I still get to be a scientist a decent amount of the time. Enough of the time that it makes me feel like I still earned the PhD and like keep that up to date. It's not getting dust. So those are things that I think are really cool. And I think the other thing is that weirdly is enjoyable for me is I'm rarely comfortable.
That's great.
Like my boss paid me a compliment later last year that was like, you're the most comfortable person I know who's being uncomfortable. I love going into new situations that are murky and muddy and we don't really know, and just being like, okay, I don't know. How would we find that? How would we learn how to do this? And start chipping away at these problems in a systematic way that honestly your PhD teaches you how to do, right? So this ability of like knowing how you learn and knowing how to problem solve allows you to go into these very uncomfortable places and create really innovative solutions for folks. And at the end of the day, the things that we build are ultimately to help people do cool science, right? And so there is some satisfaction in how many citations you get off of a certain paper, but there's also some level of satisfaction that the tools that you publish are being used by hundreds of people day in, day out, and are also generating publications and major breakthroughs in different fields that you never thought the technology that you were building was going to impact. So that part is really, really cool. And I always try to keep that into perspective during those very compressed times and those challenging work environments. But the last thing I will say, the people, um, I really do enjoy the team that I work on. They're fun people. They're super smart people. Do we have arguments? Yeah. But the good news is we can usually solve most of those arguments with data and a beer. And we're all analytically trained. We're all, trying to get to the same spot. Yeah, generally speaking, it is a very fun group of folks that we've sort of collected over the years.
Good people make all the difference. And you're one of the good ones, Cory. So thank you for doing this and offering your perspective. I think, as I said to start with, you start thinking about this question of what I'm going to do after graduate school, kind of the moment you start.
Yeah, no problem. And for the students or really anybody out there, I consider myself a resource. The US tax dollars paid for me to get a PhD. I at some level feel beholden to the population to help educate and help guide them on their journey. I'm not going to sugarcoat stuff, but I'm definitely a resource for folks.
I certainly appreciate that. I know my students will too. Thank you, Cory.
Yeah, no problem.